For more than 41 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll review the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start with the tense situation around the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk in the east of the country, which is besieged from three sides. Here we have new footage that shows us that most likely for the very first time, individual Russian soldiers successfully managed to advance all the way to Pokrovsk, just walking through the southern streets of the city. And these are recordings, it has to be clearly said, that are claimed to have been taken by a Russian drone and show Russian soldiers. However, we have no official statements from the Ukrainian side disputing this claim. And therefore we can only assume that indeed individual Russian soldiers, it appears in this case, to manage to advance relatively far into the city. However, we also see what happened before. We see here very many roofs already uncovered by Russian artillery, by Russian drones, which have struck in those areas repeatedly when the Ukrainians still had control of the whole area. And now apparently the situation is that we have huge gaps in the Ukrainian defense, especially concerning the infantry on the ground. And that's why the situation arose where individual Russian soldiers managed to get through the very porous defense. We often had far too few defenders per square kilometer, particularly in the recent months and weeks. In the southern suburbs of Pokrovsk, they managed to hold their positions, but some individuals still succeeded in getting through. We still don't have a situation where there's a fully established Russian front directly within the city, but we've consistently observed small Russian sabotage units repeatedly infiltrating the surrounding area during the night over the past few days. To bypass the Ukrainian positions, move toward Pokrovsk, and within the city itself carry out attacks or to carry out ambushes. We already showed a video a week ago where an ambush took place within the city where Ukrainians in their SUV were attacked by the enemy forces during the operation. When we zoom out, we can also see the situation here relatively well. As mentioned, we are still in a single-family home neighborhood on the southern edge of the city. However, the whole thing shows us just how complicated and difficult the situation in Pokrovsk has become by now. We'll also take a look at the whole situation on the map and see that it's clearly a very challenging and difficult scenario. We see the situation, we have this twin city, Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad here, and we have the Russians who have been pushing from the east already for a long time from the southeast. In the southwest, they were actually stopped at, let's remember, Udakny and Kotlin a few months ago. Back then, Ukraine had also reclaimed some territories. But the new development is, and that's what we just saw, that Swyrov, this suburb here, is completely under Russian control. And the footage we just saw originated from here, slightly north of Swyrov, which, according to our map provider Deep State Map, is still not shown in orange, meaning it's not yet contested. Nevertheless, we can clearly see the Russians are very close. They managed to capture the last suburbs south of Pokrovsk, including Swyrov, and are now in a position where they can advance into the various neighborhoods from there. What we don't know for sure is whether the Russians we just saw actually came from Swyrov, or if there might also be alternative routes, potentially even through the Ukrainian defense lines. Because there's a clear possibility of operating there, since we had already observed just under a week ago that an ambush occurred along this specific stretch of the road, that some individual Russian soldiers also managed to make their way into the city there. We see that the situation for Pokrovsk, formerly with 65,000 residents, is already difficult. For Myrnohrad next to it, formerly with 41,000 residents, it's even more complicated because we essentially see the encirclement from the Russian side, not just in the south, in the east, but also in the north, where the Russians have practically already moved past the city. We see that when we maybe pull this line down here, by then the Russians had advanced. That's basically already past Myrnohrad. And this partial encirclement was truly extremely challenging for the civilians and of course for the soldiers in Myrnohrad as well. Because we're in a situation where we basically only have one single road left to Pokrovsk that's somewhat passable, even if only secretly, since we clearly see the Russian fiber optic drones that are deployed everywhere. However, of course, the connection to the north via Rudinska, where the Russians are right at the edge of the town, already cut off, and there really was no going back and forth anymore for the Ukrainian. For defense and for the Ukrainian logistics. We are heading a few kilometers east to Kostiantynivka. There, we are also facing a critical situation, specifically that the last outskirts of Kostiantynivka have been taken over by the Russian army. The focus here is on Yablunivka, which we already talked about a week ago, but now also Oleksandr Kalinove, which serves as the very last suburb before the highway continues for several more kilometers straight toward Kostiantynivka. And we are seeing the footage here from the Russian army, from a Russian military blogger, published but earlier captured and recorded by the Russian army from the 33rd here. And we can see quite clearly that after these really intense months-long battles for this village, it was indeed possible to destroy the village, to drive away all the people there. But the Russians also managed to move quite freely within the village, to be on the street with their flag, without encountering any attacks at all from the Ukrainian soldiers in that particular area who were nearby. By the way, up there we see, the highway that leads in this direction leading to Pokrovsk in this direction and to Kostiantynivka in that direction. And that's extremely important for the Russians to get so close, effectively cutting off and controlling this highway, which allows them to secure a strategic foothold in the area. Here, Alexander Kalinova is seen in the background for Yablunivka, taken a few days ago. Here's the church, yes, almost completely intact, as if by a miracle. However, most of the other houses, as we've seen, were completely destroyed in the surrounding areas of these two villages. We also want to take a look at that on the map and see that the situation in Kostiantynivka has further intensified for the Ukrainian defenders. Here we also have another semi-cauldron, if you will, the Russians. Advanced in the northeast, the east, the south, and now also in the southwest. These are the two towns we just saw from the air, which have now fallen entirely under Russian control. And as we can see relatively well here, there are no other towns between Kostiantynivka and these two places we just saw that have fallen under Russian control. We also need to look at two more areas where the Russians have advanced. In the south of the country, they managed to advance from Donetsk, moving from the Velika Novosilka region into the neighboring Zaporizhia region. This time we're looking at a larger portion of the Russian propaganda video, which once again shows the unbelievable forces being deployed here. And it's crucial not to forget, these are all FAB 500 bombs being used here, targeting the defensive position of Timurivka, the first one, as mentioned, a small village in Zaporizhia. And all of this always precedes these infantry units, these attacks, and also the use of these drones. That means the extremely heavy weapons are always used first, destroying a large part of the defense, and only then are the smaller ones, so to speak, precision weapons deployed, for example, when we look at these small drones here. Now, once again, yes, it has to be said over and over, completely unviable, this entire area by now, and it's clear that nothing functions as it should. Nobody is going to settle there in the next few years. It was simply completely destroyed by Russia. But what is important to the Russians is that the Russian flag is flying over it. In that sense, they can present it as liberated, as the Russians say, completely depopulated and destroyed, and then sell it to the Kremlin. Now we see Timurivka, yet another location in the Zaporizhia region under Russian control. We also want to briefly take a look at the map to understand that the Russian offensive is continuing in the southern part of the country. As mentioned earlier, we're heading south. Velika Novosilka fell early this year. And here, unfortunately, due to the generalization, the borders are no longer as perfect as they should ideally be. We see this dashed border, which here indicates Zaporizhia, here Dnipropetrovsk, and here Donetsk. Actually, the border runs roughly along here. That's the precise border. This means we are indeed, with all the red and orange area and around Timurivka, already in Zaporizhia Oblast, which of course was also annexed by Vladimir Putin, and is therefore now being attacked over time, not just from the south, but also from the southeast, particularly from the Donetsk region. And in Donetsk, we want to stay for a moment longer. We want to take a look at another place that has also at least partly fallen under Russian control, and a highly strategic location. The small village of Torske lies directly halfway between Kremina, which has been under Russian control for 2 years now, and Lyman on the other side, which remains firmly under Ukrainian control. The main issue here is that this small village is positioned directly in the middle. Here we see the footage of it, and there the Russians managed, after very, very heavy fighting, we saw tank fire there, for example, from the Ukrainian army, from the already occupied houses, after extremely fierce fighting, to establish a strong foothold there, and in the south, in Torske, to now hoist the Russian flag. We can see this is a relatively small village. The Russians are, of course, very proud of everyone involved on their side. Nonetheless, even if it's just 3 or 4 streets, the whole thing stretches for about 5 kilometers from north to south. But we'll take a look at the map shortly. These 5 kilometers from north to south really determined whether the front was west of Kremina. We'll examine it quickly now. West of Kremina held, and the Russians were unable to push any further forward. Or whether they were approaching Lyman, and that was achieved with this capture, at least partial capture of Torske. We see the situation once again. For years we actually maintained a fairly stable front in this area, which roughly stretched along here, meaning Kremlin was Russian occupied, but Ukraine was very, very close. In Serebryansk forest, which extends here, isn't visible due to the vegetation, and now the situation is that the Russians managed to capture the absolutely crucial border village, this frontline village here, which I just mentioned, partially capture, meaning we had the situation that now the Russian flag has already been raised here in the south. In the center, fighting is still ongoing, at least that's what the Ukrainians say, and we also have not seen a Russian flag in the center yet. So it's entirely possible that Ukrainian soldiers are still holding out and putting up resistance here. And why the situation for the Ukrainians is incredibly difficult and only getting more challenging is shown in the following video, where we can clearly see that the Russian army's fiber optic drones are now being deployed at night as well. That was their final remaining window, the critical opportunity they fully depended on to move from point A to point B under the cover of night. And with that, they at least had the possibility to maintain the logistics towards the front villages and front cities. We are now seeing these ambushes. That means the traps set up by these drones that were deployed and are just waiting for the Ukrainians to come. But at night, not daytime, these shots are striking, showing the Ukrainians spotting the drone at the very last possible moment. They ran away and could only grab what they could, while their vehicle, their off-road truck, was completely destroyed once more by the Russian forces. We also have all of this, if you will, in these classic shots here, clearly visible. It's really a shame. It's actually something that was built to deter these drones. However, the fiber-guided drones simply cannot be jammed. They cannot be disrupted. And therefore, the Ukrainians again face challenges here. In the following, we also see further attacks on off-road vehicles, interestingly in cities, which means parked directly in front of the buildings, in front of the large structures where the Ukrainians have taken shelter within the cities. And that shows just how freely the Russians have been able to move and how well they've managed. Here we see it again in the background behind the trees, a large multi-story building, how well they've managed to disrupt Ukrainian logistics even before it heads toward the front, specifically in these areas which are considered relatively safe, behind the front lines to attack. And here we see it here as the last bus or something similar, yes, to hit the Ukrainians right there. Where it hurts them the most, namely in their storage areas somewhat behind the front lines, and precisely to destroy their vehicles there before they even approach the actually vulnerable areas near the front. But the Ukrainians have also perfected the use of fiber optic drones by now. We've recently acquired new footage from Bryansk, a region situated in western Russia, and in this footage we can see quite clearly that a bridge located in Bryansk, which is under Russian control, was actually mined as a precautionary measure against a potential Ukrainian attack, that this bridge was specifically targeted and attacked by a Ukrainian fiberglass drone. These are really quite impressive shots. We can clearly see here that the bridge was actually protected. That means we see that a net was actually put in front of it. I hope it's clear right away. A bit tricky to make out. So actually, like I said, a net that was placed right there. Let's pause it again right at this spot. This is the exact location where the mining was set up. These are the mines attached there in the middle to these bridge pillars, so they could be detonated in the event of a potential Ukrainian advance. You can also clearly see a net hanging here, as the Russians have become accustomed to the Ukrainians frequently using drones in their operations. And that's why they tried to protect their own mines, their own mining of their bridge. The Ukrainians came around the side, found a small hole, and then moved inside, positioning themselves directly under the bridge. Here we see it again. I hope it's visible. That's the net hanging on the side here. And the Ukrainians are now finding this really very tiny spot up here to sneak through, and then these mines, which we just saw from the other side. Now we see it. I hope you can spot it clearly here. We see all these anti-tank mines being targeted and attacked by Ukraine, and that is the Ukrainian surveillance drone that filmed everything from above, capturing a bridge that was actually mined to stop Ukraine, but currently still serves as part of Russian logistics to destroy this bridge deep within Russia. So what we see is both sides continually perfecting the use of their fiber optic guided drones. Next, we'll take a closer look at the deployment of the air forces, including both the Russian Air Force and the Ukrainian Air Force. We start with a significant Russian military strike aimed at the city of Kherson. Here we see one of the most crucial bridges in the city, as a key district lies just south of the first branch of the Dnieper River, making it essential for transportation and maintaining overall connectivity. That means south of a river that flows into the Dnieper. And we see this district here is very close to the front line, making it crucial for Ukraine, both due to its industrial presence and the defense forces stationed there, right near the front line. That's why it was so crucial for the Russians to blow up this bridge situated within Kherson just recently. We'll see they used Air Force and FAB 500 bombs to achieve this. We also see, however, that the majority of the bombs missed this bridge, which was perhaps in the context of an illegal war, one must say, a legitimate strategic target. That most of these bombs missed it and ended up hitting the civilians nearby. So we're about to see that there were quite a number of explosions happening on both the left and right side. Here we see it, the big one, of course, but at the same time there was another explosion happening over here. I can rewind that briefly. So one of the FAB 500 bombs struck here on the right, one struck on the left. And when we observe all of this, all these small explosions, which are still happening here and there, it could even be that cluster munitions were deployed at the very same time against the city. So cluster munitions, while one of the main bombs directly struck the bridge itself. Let's take a look at this. The whole thing is really pure terror against the population being used here. All these smoke plumes suddenly appearing everywhere, and the Russians only partially managed to destroy the bridge on the first day. Here we see it once more. Some damage to the bridge, but also directly in the middle of the residential areas on both sides. While the Russians continued attacking the bridge, their numbers just kept growing. Residential areas were hit. This Russian recording clearly shows, and it has to be said quite honestly, that only a small part of the bombs actually that were deployed actually hit their target. The first one missed and landed in the river. The second one went north here. I hope you can see it from our perspective, north of the map here. So another civilian area was hit, and only the third one, I think we'll see it in a moment, only the third one actually hit the bridge, at least where it was supposed to, and even there civilians were killed in the process. That means we just saw it, I believe. There were civilian vehicles for driving over that bridge just now. Here, there, and over there. Civilian vehicles everywhere. The Russians kept shooting at it regardless, and we're about to see that at least one woman was killed who had likely been walking across that bridge as a pedestrian on that very day. We're seeing it here now. Ukrainians approaching the bridge. These are official recordings. Here is the dead civilian who also appeared in the news, so to speak. And these here are the various different holes we're seeing, but we can also take another look at all the civilian areas here. These are all large residential areas that, as we've seen, were hit by some of the bombs and also by cluster munitions. In that sense, absolute terror, of course, not only against this, once again, within the context of an illegal war, perhaps legitimate strategic target, but also all the widespread fires that we saw here. Back here, we see it against civilians, which were carried out in parallel there. In stark contrast to that, the operation of the Ukrainian Air Force is what we'll examine now. Here, however, we are not talking about civilian areas being attacked, not primarily cluster munitions being fired at civilians, but rather very targeted strikes. Here we first see a MiG-29 approaching, which is about to fire an AGM-88 HARM missile. Here we see it. This missile is a weapon designed to specifically target radar systems. That means the opponent needs to be military to begin with, so the missile reacts to it at all. We're about to see more shortly, including the AASM-250 and most likely GBU bombs from American production as well, coming up next in the footage. First, a border crossing in Bryansk, controlled by the FSB right next to it. Now we see footage from Kliboke, captured in Kharkiv. Here too, it's quite obvious that the Russians just drove up with their vehicle right at this specific spot. Kliboke has been under Russian control for several years now. Here's the vehicle that was just parked, but it was detected and closely monitored by a surveillance drone, and now it's under active observation. Most likely a GBU bomb, a smaller dot caliber, less explosive than we just saw. The attacks earlier on this occupied building in Kharkiv. And at the end, we also see a military position once more, a larger one located in the country's southern region. Here too, the Ukrainians were very precise. We see the drone practically indicates the target beforehand, and the explosion occurs exactly where it was supposed to hit. And not just three to the left and right, as we recently observed in Kherson, but specifically the advanced weapons of Ukraine, or the weapons from the West that Ukraine received, relatively precise and therefore also relatively effective, albeit of course on a much too small scale to make a significant difference here, but still quite effective against the intended targets. In the end, we want to look at two strategic attacks by the Ukrainian drone fleet on refineries and other infrastructure. Let's take a look at fuel targets in Russia. These attacks were suspended over several months. Now, with Donald Trump's ultimatum and his increasing frustration toward Putin, who keeps relentlessly advancing his war of aggression, as we've just seen unfold, it seems there's another green light from the West, granting Ukraine the authorization to carry out strikes again using its long-range drones, including those essential to Russia's fuel supply network. Here we are seeing footage from Novokuybishevsk, and these images show us one of the largest refineries in the country. What we are observing here is the Ukrainian attack drone currently advancing toward this refinery, which is located approximately 1,000 kilometers away from Ukraine, and now about to strike it with remarkable precision or accuracy. We see the whole thing filmed by people who were nearby. You can definitely hear these drones, and now we can see the massive explosion quite clearly. That took place at the refinery near Novokuybishevsk already 2 days ago. However, we had a few days of reduced activity, so we can definitely follow up on that, as there are indeed recordings that clearly show how deeply Ukraine can strike into Russian territory. That the Russian air defense is still unable to fully eliminate these Ukrainian drones, which are slow-moving, highly visible, and operating at low altitudes despite their capabilities. We know Ukraine uses a significant number of these drones. Sometimes it's 5 or 10 or 15 drones per target. However, we very often see that only 2 or 3 make it through. That definitely means the Russians managed to intercept some of them, but clearly not enough to effectively stop these attacks altogether. We're now seeing the fire in Novokuybishevsk the day after, and it turns out that wasn't the only target that was attacked. Also yesterday, Ukraine launched another attack on fuel tanks, specifically targeting the ones in Sochi on the Black Sea. We see the moment here at night, shortly after the impact. Here we can observe that at the Sochi airport, several tanks, most likely storing kerosene, were directly hit and damaged. Interestingly, and now it becomes period. How should I say, unusual in any case, we see footage the next day of these burning tanks, and not from state media, not from helpers, but we see here 2 teenagers on a motorbike passing by this burning tank, and now also immediately some rather young people who likely took selfies at this location, probably for TikTok. Interestingly, no rescue teams here, no fire department, no police cordoning off the area, but rather, if you will, the TikTok army was here first, filmed the whole thing, tried to immortalize themselves there. These 3 teenagers we just saw were put on the wanted list during the day, got captured, and had to issue apologies in videos by the evening that they did the whole thing. Interestingly, in all this information, both the wanted notice and the apology, there was never any mention of a Ukrainian drone attack, but an emergency situation that was, yes, as we just saw, exploited for self-promotion, and they ended up having to apologize for it afterwards, which was misused here. That's what they said. So we see it certainly interesting footage from Russia where they are grappling with the brutal reality of war, and not just a special military operation, but rather the reality of war, which due to the daily propaganda in the Russian media doesn't seem to be fully realized yet.